Howdy. Welcome to Intensive Review. Today we're going to take a look at English traditions of government that influenced how we govern ourselves today and the values that led the colonists to declare their independence from the British. This lecture is called From England with Love, Traditions of American Government. When we hear about our president, a lot of times we hear about things that he's doing with the government. When we hear about the British royal family, that's not really the case. A lot of times we hear about them being in a parade or royal wedding, royal wedding. Will and Kate. Now, if you like something even more amusing, sometimes you see this guy, Prince Harry, who every once in a while gets himself on some tabloids. A rich guy who will never be king, who frankly has nothing better to do. And yes, why is that? Why is it that they've got a monarch who doesn't govern? Well, it's a long story, but I'm about to tell you. The English, over the last several centuries, put together a constitutional government. Now, we use the word constitution all the time in the United States, but we don't really think about what it means. Essentially, a constitutional government is a limited government. Our Constitution places limits on what the government can do, and it structures the government and says that the government is for these specific purposes. It can do these things, and it can't do these things. Thomas Jefferson, when he was protesting against the Alien Sedition Acts, wrote, "In questions of power then, let no more be heard of confidence in man, but bind him down by the chains of the Constitution." The chains of the Constitution. Let's not have a government of men. Let's have a government of laws in this country. Jefferson's not making this up. He's speaking of someone who was raised as an English colonist. He's speaking as someone who is a believer in these English traditions of government. Now, during the Middle Ages, it wasn't the government that was in chains, it was the people. We've all heard of Robin Hood. It would be kind of hard not to. In my lifetime, there have been 3 movies, a cartoon, at least one series. This champion of the poor fighting against this oppressive monarch, King John, who is just taxing the people to smithereens, who are having to steal for bread and hide in the forest. Well, it wasn't just the poor who were having trouble, but also the nobles and the clergy, who got King John to sign the Magna Carta in 1215. This is Latin for Great Charter. The Magna Carta is essentially a charter of liberties. It enshrines the principles of limited government and individual rights. More specifically, it addresses 3 things. First, the principle of taxation by consent, that the king cannot just tax anytime he wants to. He's going to have to get permission from representatives of the people before he can tax. Second, the rule of law. Even the king is a subject. The laws apply to everyone across the board, and the laws will be obeyed. The rule of law will be established, and the laws apply to everyone. And finally, the concept of jury trials, that the king cannot be the judge, that someone else is going to have to run the judicial branch. So we see the beginnings of principles of separation of powers and checks and balances. What materializes from the Magna Carta is the British Parliament, which was a body of nobles, clergymen, and later on included large landowners, the gentry. And anytime the king needed money, aside from his customary taxes that he was used to collecting, he would have to call Parliament together, and he would have to get their permission in order to tax. And if they believed that the tax is reasonable, they would show him the money. And so the King of England really wasn't a whole lot different than this little boy here wearing a crown. His powers were limited. He wasn't going to be like all the other kings in Europe that had much more power than he did. This system of the monarch and parliament governing together, the system of checks and balances, went pretty well for a while until Queen Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen, died without an heir in 1603. And because she didn't have any sons or daughters to take her place, the English had to ask the King of Scotland to come and reign, which is the beginning of the Stuart dynasty. The Stuarts were known for their belief in absolutism. Absolutism is distinct from constitutionalism. While constitutionalism is a form of limited government, absolutism is unlimited government. And the Stuarts believed in a concept called the divine right of kings. If we look at this picture of King Charles I of England, we see a mysterious hand, possibly God, an angel, who knows, putting a crown on his head. Charles lifting his hands in the air to glorify the Almighty, who has placed him in charge of the people. The divine right of kings is a top-down approach to government, that God picks the king, and the king rules over the rabble, over all of these people. God has chosen this king to be his representative on earth. The English didn't like this idea. They rejected it. And they had a civil war with Charles, and at the end of this civil war, they cut his head off. And so we see that the idea of an absolute monarch is not going to take root in England. They are going to choose constitutionalism. But Charles's son James didn't quite get it. James was quite unpopular and was a papist. What's a papist, you ask? Well, we don't use that term today, really. It's not nice. It's a way to refer to Catholics. The word Catholic means universal. So when you call somebody Catholic, you say that they're a member of the universal church. Well, the English had their Reformation, everything, and they believed the Pope's the Antichrist. Nothing universal about that. People who follow the Pope are papists. And so by this time, England is overwhelmingly Protestant, and they didn't like having a Catholic king over them. And so Parliament ran him off, and they declared the throne vacant without any major bloodshed, and so they called this revolution glorious because it was so easy. It wasn't like with Charles where they'd had to have a civil war and cut his head off to make a point. James just ran off and made it easy for him. So Parliament took out an ad in the personals. They wanted a monarch who will sit down, shut up, and let Parliament take care of the governing. Maybe somebody who will get married once in a while, or be in a parade, or go to Vegas and be in a tabloid once in a while, but not somebody who's going to govern. The English have no use for that function in a monarch. They have Parliament to do that. Mary Stuart and her husband William of Orange say, sure, we'll do that. And they come in and sign the English Bill of Rights. And the English Bill of Rights further limits their power. One of the principles of the English Bill of Rights is the principle of parliamentary supremacy, that the monarch does not make the laws, Parliament makes the laws. And so the executive power is limited. There will be free and frequent elections, and the monarch can only tax with the consent of Parliament, which had really already been laid out in the Magna Carta. And while they're at it, they decide to issue a Declaration of Rights. Some of these are going to look kind of familiar. They declare that they have the right to free speech, the right to petition the government. They have the right to arms for their defense, Protestants at least. Now, the South Carolina support document says that the English Bill of Rights upheld the concept of religious freedom. I don't know where they got that. Maybe they need to read it. It's not in there. This is one of the most bigoted documents ever created, but just keep in mind the support document says that. It may come up. Who knows? And there is a prohibition of cruel and unusual punishments and standing armies in peacetime. Now, this is kind of odd for us because we take for granted that we want to have an army anytime to defend our country. Well, back then, the English had a channel between them and Europe, they didn't really have much of a need for a standing army. So they figured, well, if we're not at war, then the only reason a monarch would need an army is to start an unnecessary war or to control the people. So they believed that armies should be disbanded when we weren't at war, which is largely the way we did it in the United States prior to World War II. And John Locke, this guy's important. A believer in natural rights. Locke was the most influential philosopher of the time, and his philosophy heavily influenced not only the English Bill of Rights, but we will see Locke come up again when we look at the Declaration of Independence a few segments from now. And Locke believed in this concept of natural rights, three of them: life, liberty, and property. Locke taught that everyone had these rights, that these rights were God-given, that God had given these rights to Adam when he created him. And since everyone is a descendant of Adam, then everyone has these rights. Locke didn't believe in this divine right concept where God picks this one person to rule over everyone else. Didn't believe in top-down. Locke believed in a bottom-up approach where the people get together and they decide what they need out of a government to protect their life, liberty, and property. They create what we'd call a social contract, that we say that in order to preserve our lives, our liberties, and our property, we will give up a little bit of our freedom, but we are going to choose which freedoms we give up in order to protect what we want protected. And so this concept of natural rights negates this idea of the divine right of kings. Locke was also a believer in religious toleration and of the idea of government by consent, that a government is only legitimate as long as the people consent to it, that when people are unhappy with their government, they can either make changes to it or, worst case scenario, they can get rid of it. We call this the right of revolution. And you want to note that the colonists, when they came from England, they brought these political traditions with them, traditions of constitutional government and representative government that we talked about last time. And in New England, remember that these took the form of town meetings, which were egalitarian and democratic. All of the men in the community participated. Whereas in the Virginia colony, you had the House of Burgesses, which was a more aristocratic representative body made up of large landowners. Now, just because everybody didn't participate didn't mean that everyone wasn't represented. Anybody who owned property voted for someone to sit in the House of Burgesses, and the House of Burgesses had the exclusive authority to tax in Virginia, as did all of the other colonial legislatures. So keep that in mind when you take a test, that these people here can tax. Parliament and the king cannot, because those are not their representatives. They believe that this was part of their rights as Englishmen to have these colonial legislatures that had exclusive authority to tax them. Now, for the most part of colonial history, the English practiced a policy known as salutary neglect. And they let the colonies develop how they would, that they would trade with whoever they wanted. They would pass taxes on themselves. They would make their own laws with very little interference from the mother country. This would change quite a bit after the French and Indian War, which was very expensive for the English government, and the English government decided that they were going to recoup their cost. And in doing so, they proceeded to run a train over those colonies. And so next time we are going to look at a long train of abuses and usurpations which led to the American Revolution. Until then, keep in mind that I've got lots of review materials available on my website, tomrichey.net. There's much more where this came from. Take care.